What's happening, guys, and welcome back to another Sunday scan. I am traveling, so we are going to do a quick and effective scan this week. It's just me, so we're going to run through some recent market moves, go over what's really important for the week ahead, what could move the market, and individual tickers, and then we'll go over a couple of really cool setups that I've been seeing in the market, and just kind of some themes to go along with that. So we'll get right into it. Before I really start to talk about some of these names, I will disclose that I am not a financial advisor, and these are not buy or sell recommendations. Everything that I'm going to talk about is for informational and educational purposes only. So let's get right into scan. Basically, for the week ahead, we have a couple of major themes that I'm watching. One is we're in the middle of earnings season still. So we had a couple names like Tesla and Alphabet report last week, and really, I like to look at the big players that really move the market. So we always hear about how concentrated or spread out the market can be, and a lot of times when it's very concentrated, it's those magnificent seven names or those really 10 stocks that drive the major moves in the market. So especially during earnings season, I like to pay attention a lot to those, and just to see are they broadly doing okay? Are their margins fine? Are they making more money? Are they expanding revenue and sales? And then how does that spill over into other names like NVIDIA? So perfect example is Google, which I'll pull this up. We had Google report earnings last week, and they not only affirm that they're doing pretty well financially, but also they're expanding their capex. So that really spills into other names like NVIDIA. So those are things that I like to pay attention to, because as long as the status quo, or that's kind of expected, then that's totally fine. But what happens is that if you have a couple of these names say, oh well, actually we're not seeing the same return on investment from that capex as we thought, then we're going to start scaling that down, and that it can affect the other markets like NVIDIA or the semiconductor or the AI sector. So far so good. Everything's kind of affirmed, so that part of the market is still running hot. We also had Tesla, which I'll pull up, and kind of as expected, we were, kind of expecting Tesla to not have that great of financials, just given everything that's happened this year. Sales are down, revenue's down. Elon was off doing other things, so no surprise that the business was kind of suffering there. But we've also been talking about how sometimes, even when this bad news is expected, if they're pivoting their narrative to more like the robo-taxis, or that's becoming the focus, then sometimes the investment analysts and people who are kind of pitching this company to some of the bigger names, they'll kind of highlight those aspects instead of some of the more traditional aspects of the business. So we saw Tesla hold up pretty well. It was gapping up a little bit after hours, after earnings, and then it opened up and it flushed down the next day, and now just kind of consolidated back to somewhere in the middle. So really pretty unchanged. And even after not great earnings, I think that's a good tell that we're just in a super hot market. And regardless of some of the financials of these big companies, that they're still hanging on pretty well. So a couple other things that are really going on this week, other than earnings, is we have the Fed interest rate decision on Wednesday. So Powell and the board of directors at the Fed will decide whether to leave rates in place or cut them. And the expectation for this one is to leave it in place and then maybe a cut at the next meeting. So that's kind of like the standard. And if we see any deviation from that path, then we could have some moves in the market. And then one other thing kind of related to that is also this week we have the Treasury refilling announcement. So basically in like the bond market, when the Treasury talks about how much they actually need to borrow, or how many bonds, how the quantity in dollar amounts of bonds that need to go to the market, that's going to get announced. And if it's a huge number, that can affect yields and all that stuff. So not something that people have to really pay attention to a lot. But if you have an outlier kind of number pop up, that will spill into the bond market, and most likely the equity market as well. So I'll comment on that in IU as I see it in real time. That's definitely something I pay attention to, and it usually happens about once a quarter or a couple times a year, that it really can spill into the main market. And then a couple other things is we had almost like the meme fever return for a couple of days last week. We had things like OPEN and KSS, and I won't comment so much on just like the the meme stuff, and that's more just as you have a hot market, you're going to have things like that pop up, of course. But I did want to talk about some of the action of things like KSS and how you can compare that with some other names. So basically, when you have a move like KSS, gaps up, huge, massive move, and then just an immediate unwind as people cash in on that, or as the move doesn't really have a substantial reason to keep going, and the market is spread between different names. So you can see kind of this giant gap up and then this fade, and then I want you to compare that with something like this BE, which was really on my watch this week, and I'll get into this later on in the main watches, but BE was an example of good news that held. So basically, when you have an event or a catalyst or something, you can have two reactions to it. Usually, you can either have a big pop and a clear out and then a fade right back, or you basically get these big gap ups and then they hold. And that's just a really good comparison of a stock that will most likely continue to run, because that demand wall is rising with it, versus a stock that gaps up and it clears out all the short interest, but once that's done, it goes right back. And we kind of talk about this concept with clear out moves and squeezes and things like that, where with the liquidity trap, for example, if you have a name where you had a big volume day, it spiked up a lot, then it consolidated, and then it spikes up again, but it's just short covering. Once that short covering is done, it goes right back down. So that's an example with the liquidity trap. But if you also have a name that is just, has high short interest in it, and it has some kind of event or a catalyst or a meme craze, and it clears out all that short interest, but the only thing really driving it up was that short covering, and you can see it goes right back down. So that's just a good thing to keep in the back of your mind when you see some of these stocks spike, whether on news or whether on an event or anything like that. Notice the reaction in the coming days, and you can see what category it falls into, and that can kind of help you differentiate the moves that are part of a trend, part of a theme, have rising demand, and they continue on, versus the names that are just pop and drop. So that was a really good comparison that I saw. So we'll get into the main watches. We'll talk about a couple of themes and go over some names that I have on watch for the week ahead. So like I was mentioning before, Google reaffirmed their CapEx spending with NVIDIA. And really the main theme other than NVIDIA has been the AI power plays. And that's been a huge example for the last year or so, but it's really been speeding up, especially as the market heats up. And this is one of those go-to themes. So GEV, they even gapped up on earnings. So, you can tell that it's a theme, there's demand for it, and then almost any kind of catalyst or any kind of earnings call is helping them in that regard. And you can see some other names like OKLO, they've been announcing a ton of partnerships, and kind of the same thing where it's one of the hottest themes. They have good news flow. You can just see that, all these dips have been soaked so far. It's breaking out to new all-time highs. It's had bullish options flow. So these are the names that are leading, whether it's on the main part of the market or whether it's on the more speculative part of the market, but they are definitely leading. And you can see something similar with names like SMR. So like I mentioned before, this BE stock had a good news catalyst the other day, and it was basically that they have fuel cell technology that they're using with Oracle on some of their campuses to power some of their AI stuff. So just how OKLO and SMR, they're more like the nuclear theme for the AI power, and you have other names like GEV, which might be more like utilities for AI power. This is just kind of another angle of that same play, the AI power theme, but just a different technology. So as kind of the power needs for AI ramps up, people are going to be looking at all corners of the market, and anything that has solid news flow with especially a name like Oracle, which is leading kind of in that space. I think that you're going to have some significant moves. So this was out a couple of days ago, and the news came out pre-market, and you can tell that same concept that we talk about gap ups, holding, that works on different time frames too. So a lot of times you'll see some pre-market run-ups and then a gap up at the open, and you can tell by how far it sits back how sustainable that move can be sometimes. So this gapped up and it held pretty well, maybe faded a dollar or two back down, but it was holding basically around that 30 level or a bit above, and then just started to build dollar by dollar over the next couple of days. So when you spot a move like that, depending on how deep you read into either the move or the fundamentals or the news, if you've been following the company, you can have things that are potentially more like that episodic pivot where, if this name was just kind of chopping along for a while, but now it's suddenly tapped into that AI power theme, and it has a big partner like Oracle, and it's that can really put it into the spotlight. So you can see, like Phil Godeker was talking about a couple of weeks ago, those breakouts with big volume, with good catalysts and a good market. That's really what you want to see for continuation. And then on top of that, see how well they're holding the gap ups, and that can help you to differentiate of, was this just, kind of a heavily shorted stock? It had news, it cleared that out, and it goes all the way back down? Or is this actually gapping up with volume and it's holding? And that really works on almost any time frame to gauge the strength of something. And I even use it for short squeezes sometimes. When I'm looking at a squeeze, we talk about these supply and demand imbalances that happen. And basically when, it's something super short, crowded, has a lot of float rotation, and then it starts to basically grind up and then triggers and squeezes, you'll see that very same type of action where it'll be kind of candle after candle on multiple time frames, just one stacked on top of the other, and each candle's holding pretty well. And that's a sign that there's a lot of tension or demand. So all those dips, they run into a wall of demand that is moving up as the move continues. So BE will definitely be on watch for continuation. I think this is a name that, could potentially be a swing name, or it could be, maybe you look for a dip off the open and then you're risking low of day. And then, if you can get it to pull up, a couple of points, then you can really, ride that for a while with that cushion. They do have earnings coming up too, so that's something to be cautious of. But like we saw with GEV, if they're mentioning a lot of partnerships and things like that, then that can be a big catalyst for more continuation to the upside. CRWV. So Nate's been all over this one. We talked about this last week. Just a great unwind. You can see just the wind up on the way up and then the wind down here. And then Stan and I were talking about last week how if you're looking at trends on the way up, it really is helpful to look at the bottom side of that trend. You can see how well, those dips hold. And then once you have kind of the backside of the move in, you can use that resistance line in the same way just to see how well is that resistance holding. And that's because on the way up, the demand side is really soaking all those dips. And you can see that process of the demand wall rising. And it's the same thing here where you have the supply wall falling. So basically more and more supply is coming, and every pop has been met with supply so far. So I think this will be on watch for continuation to the downside until we get to a big, probably psychological number. I think right around that 100 mark would be a pretty good chance for a bounce. So especially if we got a sharp kind of capitulation or, an increase in volume and a big flush down to that level, I would be looking for a bounce long. But until then, if it's slow and steady, I think we're just going to see some more unwind in that name. And then another one, SBET, you can see that this is kind of the action of something being on the backside of the move as well, where again, using those basic trend lines on the way up and then basic trend lines on the way down. And that can really help to differentiate the front side versus the backside of the move. And, they announced like they had a up to $5 billion of, common stock that they could offer, or some kind of $5 billion offering that they're able to tap into. So even though the price of Ethereum has been strong, and that is what this company is allegedly, based on, that's a good sign that they're tapping the ATM, or there's other factors that are causing pressure. It's not just what it should be anchored to, which is the price of Ethereum. But if something's trading much above NAV, then it becomes much more about the supply and demand of how many shares are they selling versus the actual underlying commodity. And we see that with things like BMNR, as well. The same thing with the Ethereum strategy. IBM reported earnings. No major, developments in the quantum space, but still these technical charts are looking pretty good for now. So until we get a big news event that kind of derails that, I think that the quantum names are just a good gauge for how hot the market is. Speculative money running around, and it's just like 2021. And that's actually another point I wanted to bring up. In 2021, you had these speculative themes, but like take the EV sector, for example. So you had Tesla, but then you also had NIO and Lucid and all these names that were really just like one of the main themes during that COVID era, or like right after in 2021. And now that's kind of the AI power generation and some of these quantum names and things like that. So just kind of comparing previous cycles when the market's hot and you have these speculative themes going, you just replace them with what's the current theme in this current market. And we have a couple of those. UNH talked about this one a little bit last week. They have earnings coming up, and that should give a lot of clarity. They disclosed that they're under some investigations by the DOJ for some of their practices. And so basically, this is a name where I think if you have any more negative news, it can probably take out these lows. But again, if they somehow on earnings talk about that the earnings have still been pretty stable despite all the bad news, and maybe you have an activist investor step in or do something to boost confidence, then maybe you could get a reversion up. But so far, the action is really telling me that I think that we're going to retest these lows and maybe get a puke out unless you really have a positive earnings reaction on that. So that'll be on watch. And then speaking of negative news, we have SRPT. This is one that has continued to fall. They had a problem with one of their main products that was a huge generator of revenue for them, and the FDA is basically telling them to stop shipments to that. And so that was the whole thing. And you can see that the reaction has been pretty brutal on this part. But with some of these names like this, after they've sold off so hard, and there's not a whole lot of, I would say, meat on the bone for, just a continued downside, what I like to look for is headlines that can clear out that short interest. So just like we talked about with KSS before, even though the move isn't sustainable, if you have a stock that is positioned too bearishly, there's too much shorts or too much short interest on it, it's pretty crowded. When you get those headlines that can basically scare some people out of those positions, you can get these really sharp moves, but they don't last. So the same concept applies to SRPT, where you can be on watch, kind of knowing that the positioning is super bearish on this, knowing that people have been piling on and writing it down, but waiting for those headlines, whether they happen on X or whether they happen from the company themselves, that could potentially disrupt that short thesis. You can get these major reactions of 10, 20, 30% sometimes in the course of a few minutes. And so if you're kind of aware of that and you see a headline that looks like it's positive and it is acting like that, those can be some really good bounce trades, either with options or with equity. So that will be a name on watch for me in the week ahead. And then the last one I want to talk about was just this PMN. So this has been a big, a big strategy that I've been using in this current market, especially with small caps, is really looking for these names that have, lower floats, high float rotation, and then they're either trappy or they're setting up for some kind of a liquidity trap. So basically, at some point in this structure, you have it get short crowded, it's thin, it's rotating the float a bunch. It has a ton of volume compared to the float. And then, shorts get a little bit caught and then you get those squeeze out. So you can see it's happened several times over the course of the last, couple of weeks. And those are some really good opportunities that I like to do. So a lot of times what I'll see in the mornings is I'll look for these names that have the high float rotation. They're usually up a ton. And I'm just waiting for a point where they start to get a bit trappy. So I think we had some good trades, even in a pocket like this. Let me zoom in here. So after a big move up here, you can see faded back down, but still kind of holding these levels. You're seeing the dip and rips, the float rotation's going crazy, and it starts to build a higher low. And once it starts to build from there, you're again getting that same kind of concept with KSS, where you basically have a situation where you're going to get some kind of a big clear out or a squeeze, and you can participate in that, but you can't assume that it's going to build and continue, because if it's just the short covering that is the move, once that is done, whether it's hundreds of thousands of shares or 1 million shares or 2 million shares, once that is done, usually the move kind of settles down with that. So again, using those basic concepts like the candle after candle, whatever time frame, 2 minute, 5 minute, 1 minute. Usually I like to use a little bit more than 1 minute, like either 2, 3, or 5 minute for some of those, but those can be some really good trades. And we had this one go from, maybe 110 or so up to 150 in the course of 5 or 10 minutes. There was probably 10 or 15 minutes actually, because there were some halts thrown in there, but those can be some great trades. So I've been scoping out a lot of those in this current market. So kind of a way that I like to prep for some of those moves is just when you get to the market or as you're scanning in pre-market, look for the names that are a little bit, maybe trappy, maybe they have some dip and rips, they have high float rotations or a huge amount of volume traded compared to the float. They're lower floats, and they just seem to be like the one that everyone wants to short that day. And then usually, especially if they're up in pre-market, I wait for them to flush off the open, and then around that 10 a.m. point or so, I look for dip and rips. And if they're not breaking down by then, if they're starting to make higher lows, there's a good chance that there's going to be a clear out move with that. And so either risking low of day or prior bars, if you wait for them to start to trigger, there's a bunch of different ways to play those, or just drawing those key levels that we talk about all the time, and just having some kind of solid level to basically use as some kind of a risk area. And then if you're right, maybe you make 50, 60, 70 cents. And if you're wrong, maybe you lose 10 or 15 cents. And so as long as you have a pretty good reward to risk ratio, and these are working in this market, then that's been a great strategy. So that's really all I wanted to cover for today. A little bit of a shorter scan, but I'll be more active in the upcoming week. We'll talk through all these stocks in IU live as always. And that's really all I have for this week. So I'll see you guys in chat, and I hope that you have a great rest of your weekend.
Thank you everyone for watching. If you want to trade live alongside me and other members of the Investors Underground community, then check out investorsunderground.com to see if becoming a member is the right decision for you. They have some of the best technology and a lot of great members there, all looking to help other people improve their trading. And also check out Investors Underground content on YouTube and Twitter. Thank you.